Ethan Cole had 3 bags. That was the first thing the Velri docking crew noticed. Not his height, though that came second, 5 feet 11 inches in a station built for beings that averaged 7.5 feet, which meant Ethan spent the first 10 minutes of his arrival ducking under nothing and still somehow looking like he was. Not his face, which was unremarkable in the way that flat, open landscapes are unremarkable. Nothing wrong with it, nothing that jumps out, the kind of face that makes people forget they've already met him twice. No. First it was the bags. 3 of them. Standard Earth travel bags, scuffed at the corners, tagged with cryofreight stickers from half a dozen deep orbital stations. One of the docking crew said something in Velri. The translator bead on Ethan's collar caught it, processed it, and rendered it in plain English. It said, "Is that all?" Ethan set his bags down, looked at the crew member, and nodded. That's all. He was 34 years old and had spent 11 of those years on cold stations at the outer edge of Earth's mining territory, where the most valuable things a man could carry were the things that fit in a small bag and still worked at -60. He had learned early that attachment to objects was a weight problem, and weight problems in deep orbital environments had a way of becoming survival problems. So, 3 bags. Everything he owned, everything he needed, and nothing extra. The crew member looked at the bags one more time and then looked away. The way you look away from something you've already decided doesn't require further thought. Owen Drake appeared at Ethan's shoulder. Owen was Earth's diplomatic attaché to the Velri Empire, a man in his late 40s who had the particular energy of someone who had read every brief ever written about this assignment and was now discovering that briefs and reality had a complicated relationship. He was also sweating, which was a consistent feature of Owen regardless of temperature. How was the transit? Owen asked. Fine, Ethan said. Good. Good. Owen looked around the docking bay with an expression that suggested he found very little of it good. They've arranged the formal reception for this evening. Full court. Princess Vyra will be present. The ambassador from the third house will also be there, which is, there are some political layers there that I'll brief you on, but the short version is just don't mention the Kalari border dispute and you'll be fine. Okay, Ethan said. Also. Owen lowered his voice, which accomplished nothing since the nearest Velri crew member was 40 feet away and probably not interested. They may say things about, you know, the size difference. The Earth, generally. The Velri have a very direct communication culture and some of their directness can come across as. I'll be fine, Ethan said. Owen looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, not entirely convinced, and led him down a corridor wide enough to drive a truck through. The station was enormous in the way that things built by civilizations that had been spacefaring for 3,000 years tend to be enormous, not showy, just scaled to different assumptions about what was normal. The ceilings were high enough that Ethan couldn't see the light fixtures clearly. The corridors were wide. The chairs in the waiting area outside the diplomatic suite were each roughly the size of a small sofa. Everything was built for bodies bigger than his, and nobody had made any adjustment for the fact that he was coming. He sat in one of the chairs anyway. His feet didn't quite touch the floor. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the walls, the material, the joins, the way the ventilation grills were positioned. He noted the temperature differential between the corridor and the suite. He did this the way he did most things, without any particular expression, just quietly and thoroughly, the way a man does when he has spent a decade in environments where the difference between noticing something and not noticing it was sometimes the difference between going home and not going home. Then Owen came back and said it was time. The formal reception hall had a ceiling that disappeared. That was how it felt, walking into it. The ceiling was so high that the upper part of the room was in a kind of permanent architectural twilight, and the floor was pale stone, and the light came from strips along the walls that cast everything in a blue-silver color that made Ethan feel mildly like he was at the bottom of a very clean ocean. There were maybe 200 Velri in the room. Every single one of them looked at him when he walked in. He had expected this. He walked across the floor at the same pace he walked everywhere, which was the pace of a man with no particular hurry and nothing to prove, and he did not look at his feet, and he did not look at the ceiling, and he did not perform anything for anyone in the room. He did take in the room. All of it. Quickly, thoroughly, the way he always did. Princess Vyra Sandal was standing on the raised platform at the far end of the hall, and she was, by any standard Ethan could apply, remarkable. 7 feet and some inches, built like the Velri warrior caste she had been raised among, with silver-grey skin and eyes that were a dark amber color and a posture that said she had never once in her life wondered whether she belonged in a room. She wore formal court armor over a deep blue robe, ceremonial rather than functional, and she held herself the way people hold themselves when every room they have ever walked into has reorganized itself around them. She looked at Ethan as he approached. He saw the moment it happened, the small recalibration in her expression, the almost imperceptible shift from formal neutrality to something that was not hostile but was definitely not warm. She was taking in his height, his build, his 3 bags, which a palace attendant was carrying behind him. The entirely ordinary quality of him in a room that expected something at least symbolically impressive. He stopped at the appropriate distance. The protocol officer announced his name and his title, Earth Diplomatic Envoy, Proposed Consort, in Velri, and then in the common trade language, and then in English for his benefit. Vyra looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. It was not a performance. That was the thing about it. It was a real laugh, the kind that happens before the person decides whether to let it happen, and that made it worse than any calculated insult could have been. She said something in Velri to the court, and the translator bead on Ethan's collar caught it without mercy and rendered it perfectly. They sent a claything, she said. Earth sent us a claything in good clothes. The court laughed. Not all of them. A few near the edges had the controlled expressions of diplomats who understood optics, but enough. The sound moved through the room like a wave and settled. Owen, at Ethan's shoulder, made a small strangled sound. Ethan looked at Vyra. He smiled. It was a plain, unhurried smile, the kind that doesn't ask for anything and doesn't apologize for anything either. "It's good to meet you," he said. And then he waited, calmly, for whatever came next. Nobody in the room knew what to do with that. Not even Vyra, though she recovered faster than the rest and moved the reception forward with the practiced ease of someone who had been trained since childhood to control a room. But the smile stayed with her, in a small, irritating way, for the rest of the evening. It didn't ask for her approval. That was the part she couldn't place. She had been laughed at before, by people who wanted something from her, and they all had the same look afterward, the soft, careful look of someone managing the damage. Hoping she hadn't gone too far. Ethan's smile had no management in it. No damage control. No hope. It was just a smile. Easy and self-contained, like a door that was locked not because someone was hiding something, but because the person inside simply didn't feel like being visited. Later, in her private chambers, Vyra told her head attendant that the Earth consort was going to be very boring. The attendant agreed. Neither of them thought about him again that night. In his quarters, large by Earth standards, comically small by Velri standards, with a chair he had to climb into, Ethan unpacked his 3 bags with the efficiency of someone who had done it in worse places. He arranged his tools on the workbench by the window. He laid out the components he'd brought, the ones the station customs officer had logged as miscellaneous technical hobby materials, low value, approved. He looked at them for a moment. Then he started to work, the title they gave him translated, roughly, to the princess's kept companion. Owen Drake had tried to soften this during the briefing. He'd called it a ceremonial designation with deep cultural roots in Velri bonding traditions. Ethan had nodded, thanked him, and then looked it up himself in the trade language dictionary he kept on his tablet. The dictionary was less diplomatic than Owen. It said, kept companion. It also offered a secondary translation that meant something closer to decorative ward, which was, if anything, more accurate. Ethan didn't mind. He had been given quarters on the east wing of the palace, 3 rooms that were large by Earth standards and modest by Velri ones, with ceilings high enough that he could have stacked 2 of himself and still had room. The furniture was Velri scaled, which meant the bed was the size of a small swimming pool and the desk came up to his chest if he stood flat-footed. He requisitioned a step stool from the palace supply corps on his second day. The duty clerk, a young Velri with rust-colored eyes, stared at the request for a long moment before approving it. He added it to the list of things that got reported back to the court as evidence of his smallness. That was fine too. Life in the palace had a rhythm to it, and Ethan fell into it the way he fell into most things, without resistance, without complaint, without any performance of adaptation. He attended the court functions he was required to attend, stood in the position they had assigned him, and watched. He ate the food, which was rich and strange and occasionally made his stomach feel like it was conducting an internal debate. He learned 30 words of Velri beyond what the translator bead covered, because knowing 30 words in a language means you catch the tone of a room 3 seconds before the translation arrives, which is sometimes the only advantage a man needs. Vyra was rarely in the same room as him. When she was, She used him the way a speaker uses a prop, briefly, for effect, and then set aside. She compared his arm span to a Velri adolescence during a court dinner, which got a solid laugh. She asked him, during a trade reception, whether Earth's gravity was so weak that it simply failed to build proper people, and the ambassador from the second house thought this was very funny. She called him the Claything, casually, in passing, the way you refer to a piece of furniture by its function rather than its name. The court followed her lead, which was what courts did. Ethan smiled, mostly. Occasionally, he said something short and flat in response that wasn't quite a comeback and wasn't quite agreement and left people slightly unsure of what had just happened. He did not perform embarrassment for them. He did not perform anything. This was, he knew, the most unsettling thing he could do, and he did it completely by accident, because the truth was he simply wasn't embarrassed. He had been in places that were genuinely frightening. He had spent 3 months on a station where the thermal shielding was failing at a rate that the company had decided was within acceptable risk parameters, and the crew had decided was going to kill us all slowly. Against that, a 7-foot woman calling him a Claything in front of 200 people ranks somewhere around mildly inconvenient. He spent his free hours at the workbench. The components he'd brought were the kind of things that looked like nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at: pressure couplings, cryocompression fittings, a dispersal nozzle from a mining rig's emergency atmospheric suppression system, coils of insulated tubing, a power cell casing that he was repurposing in ways its manufacturer had not intended. He sent requisition requests to the Palace Supply Corps every few days. Small things. Things with no obvious relationship to each other. The duty clerk reviewed them, noted that they were all rated low value and non-hazardous, and approved them without particular interest. The servants who cleaned his quarters reported back to the palace staff, who reported to the court, that the human was building something on his workbench. Nobody could identify what it was. It looked, one servant said, like something a child had assembled from parts found in a waste bin. It was asymmetric. It had tubes going in directions that didn't seem to connect to anything useful. It made a faint hum when he worked on it late at night that was not quite a comfortable frequency. Vira received this report along with her morning briefing. "Let the Claything play," she said, and moved on to the border reports. The moment that nobody told her about happened on a Thursday, which was not a concept the Velri had but which Ethan's body still observed out of 11 years of habit. He was walking back from the palace library. He'd been reading technical documents on Velri atmospheric systems, logged as the human's quaint interest in engineering, approved without review, when he passed a junction corridor where 3 Velri engineers were crouched over an open wall panel with the particular body language of people who had been losing for several hours. The palace's thermal regulation grid had developed a fault. The cascade was subtle, the kind of thing that takes a long time to find if you're looking at the system the way it was designed to be looked at, which was the only way the engineers knew how to look at it. Ethan stopped. He looked at the open panel. He looked at the readouts on the engineer's diagnostic tablet, which was facing outward and readable from where he stood. He looked at the junction configuration. He saw it in about 40 seconds. He almost kept walking. It wasn't his station. It wasn't his problem. The engineers hadn't asked him anything, and they wouldn't, because asking the kept companion for technical advice was not something that fit into any mental category they had available. But the fault, left unaddressed, would create a pressure variance in the East Wing's atmospheric system within about 6 hours, and his quarters were in the East Wing, and he slept better in regulated atmosphere. He stopped walking. He pointed at the secondary coupling on the left side of the panel, not the one the engineers were examining, the other one, the one that looked fine, and he explained, in plain language with a metaphor about water pressure in pipes that he judged they would understand, that the fault wasn't where they were looking. It was a cascade point. The Real break was upstream. He told them where to look. They looked. They found it. He kept walking. He did not look back. He did not wait to see if they were impressed, because he wasn't doing it to impress anyone. He was doing it because it was a straightforward problem and he'd seen the solution, and the East Wing's atmosphere was going to be uncomfortable if nobody fixed it. The engineers fixed the fault in 20 minutes. They told the maintenance chief, who told the facilities manager, who filed a report that described the discovery as an independent identification during routine corridor transit. Nobody told Vira that the Claything had solved in 40 seconds what her engineers hadn't managed in 6 hours. And in his quarters that night, Ethan fit 2 more components together on the workbench, checked the compression seals, and noted in his small, precise handwriting that the assembly was about 60% complete. The device was still ugly. He didn't care about that either. The word moved through the palace the way cold moves through a room with a broken window, fast, and in every direction at once. Gorith. Ethan heard it first as sound, before the translator bead had a chance to render it, and he knew from the way people moved that the word was the kind that didn't need translation. You could hear it. The hard stop at the end. The way the Velri who said it dropped their voice on the second syllable. The way humans drop their voice when they say something they would rather not be saying at all. He was in the east corridor when it happened. He had been walking back from the supply room, having picked up the last two components he needed for the assembly, which he was carrying in a cloth bag under his arm. Around him, the palace erupted. Not in chaos. The Velri were not a people who erupted in chaos easily. They were too trained for that, too proud, but in the kind of fast, controlled movement that happens when something has gone badly wrong and everyone knows exactly what the procedure is because they have practiced it, which is somehow more frightening than chaos, because it means the threat is real enough to have a procedure. Courtiers moved toward interior rooms. Guards moved toward the outer corridors. Palace staff pulled the large security doors at the junction points, which were thick enough that Ethan could feel the air pressure change when they sealed. He stopped a passing attendant, a young one, wide-eyed, moving too fast. "What is a Gorith?" he asked. The attendant stared at him for a moment, the way people stare when they can't believe the question is sincere. Then she answered, because there wasn't time not to. She described it in 4 sentences. By the 3rd sentence, Ethan had a reasonable picture. By the 4th, he had stopped listening and started thinking. He went to his quarters. The Gorith, as the attendant had described it and as Ethan subsequently filled in from his own knowledge of the Outer Belt's fauna, he had read the xenobiology files on his transit, because he read everything available about any environment he was going to spend time in, was a creature from the heavy gravity moons at the outer edge of Velthra space. It was large. It was cold-blooded in the specific way that mattered, which was that its core temperature was low enough that heat-based weapons lost a significant portion of their effect on it. Its hide was layered, dense outer tissue over a structural underlayer that absorbed kinetic impact the way water absorbs a stone, distributing the force rather than resisting it. Velthri plasma rifles, which were the standard military sidearm, worked on it the way a spray bottle of water works on a very large fire. They annoyed it. The protocols for a Gorith incursion involved a full warrior team, heavy suppression equipment that was stored in the armory on the palace's lower level, and a tactical retreat that bought time for the equipment to be brought up. Those protocols, Ethan noted as he moved through his quarters to the workbench, assumed the Gorith had entered through an external point and was moving toward the palace. They did not appear to account for a Gorith that had been released inside the palace grounds already, which was what had happened based on the direction the guards had been moving when he'd seen them in the corridor. Someone had put the creature inside the walls. He didn't know who yet, and it wasn't the immediate problem. He looked at the device on the workbench. It was finished. He had fitted the last 2 components in his head during the walk back from the supply room, and the physical assembly would take about 4 minutes. He looked at it. He looked at the cloth bag in his hand. He set the bag down, sat on the stool, and finished the assembly with the focused quiet of a man completing a task he's been working on for a while and is reasonably confident about. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He fitted the shoulder rig, checked the compression seals twice, checked the power cell connection, and ran a manual pressure test on the dispersal chamber by feel, because he knew the tolerances well enough that he didn't need instruments for it. The chamber held. The seals were good. The power cell read full. He picked it up. It was heavy on one side in a way he'd expected and compensated for by weighting the rig on the opposite shoulder. It looked, he was aware, like something that had been assembled in a spare room from mismatched parts, which was precisely what it was. He put it on and walked out. In the outer courtyard, Commander Sarel had already engaged the Gorith with a 7-warrior team, and the engagement was going the way engagements with Goriths went when the heavy suppression equipment hadn't arrived yet. The creature was enormous. Ethan had known this from a description, but knowing a thing and seeing it were different, and it moved with the kind of mass that made the ground feel different under your feet when it changed direction. It was not fast, exactly, but it was relentless, which was worse, because fast things can be waited out and relentless things cannot. Sarel went in first. Sarel was the best warrior in the palace. Ethan had watched him train twice through the courtyard window, and he was genuinely impressive, fast, and precise and without any wasted motion. Sarel hit the Gorith with enough force to have ended most things. The Gorith absorbed it, turned, and threw Sarel through a stone partition the way you'd throw something you'd picked up off the floor and decided wasn't useful. Sarel hit the wall and stayed there, not dead but not moving, which was, under the circumstances, the best possible outcome of that interaction. 3 more warriors followed. Different angles. Coordinated. Good tactics. Same result. Ethan was walking across the outer courtyard now, moving at the same pace he walked everywhere. Several people saw him. A palace staff member shouted at him to get inside, and 2 courtiers watching from a high window made sounds that suggested they found his presence in the courtyard either baffling or briefly amusing, because some habits were apparently too deep to interrupt even during a Gorith attack. Vyra was standing at the edge of the courtyard, near the warrior line that was holding position while the heavy equipment came up. She had a blade in her hand, ceremonial in weight but still a blade, and she held it like someone who knew what to do with it, which Ethan had expected. She was the kind of person who did not leave a room when the room became dangerous. He had noted this early on. It was one of the things about her that he respected without having any particular reason to say so. She saw him crossing the courtyard with the device on his shoulder. Her expression did not change immediately. The first response was the one she couldn't control, a flicker of something that might have been surprise or concern, or the beginning of an instinct to shout at him to go back inside before something large stepped on him. Then she saw the device. Her expression changed in a different way. Not recognition. She didn't know what it was. But she was smart enough to know she didn't know what it was, which meant she had the rare quality of not filling that gap with assumption. The Gorith had seen Ethan by now. It recalculated. Small, soft, no visible weapons beyond the asymmetric object on its shoulder that didn't register as a threat. It oriented toward him. Ethan planted his feet. He checked the angle, adjusted 2 degrees left, and braced the rig properly against his shoulder. The Gorith charged. Thinking the Gorith closed the distance the way boulders come down a hillside, not fast, but with the kind of weight behind it that made speed irrelevant, because when something that large reaches you, the speed it was moving it stops mattering and only the impact does. Ethan did not move. This was, for the watching court, the most incomprehensible part. Warriors moved. Warriors charged or sidestepped or repositioned. Even the bravest of Sarel's team had adjusted their footing, angled their bodies, done something with their feet that acknowledged the thing coming at them. Ethan stood still in a way that looked less like bravery and more like a man who had decided exactly where he needed to be and had already been there. He fired. The sound the device made was not impressive. There was no crack, no boom, no surge of visible energy. There was a sharp mechanical exhale, the sound of a compression chamber releasing, and then a sound that had no good comparison in Velri experience but that the Velri would later describe, in reports and in private conversation, as something between a hiss and a silence. Like the moment after a bell rings, but cold. The cryodispersal field expanded outward in a cone that Ethan had spent some time calculating, because the geometry of how crystallization propagates through dense biological tissue under compression was something he knew with the detail of a man who had spent a decade making sure it didn't happen accidentally in populated spaces. On deep orbital mining stations, a cryocascade in a pressurized inhabited corridor was one of the worst things that could happen. You spent years learning how to contain it, redirect it, control exactly where it went and how fast it went there. He had spent those years. The field hit the Gorith at 6 feet of distance, which was close enough that Ethan could smell it, a deep, cold smell, like stone in winter, and what happened next happened faster than the eye could follow as a sequence. It could only be received as a result. The Gorith froze. Not a slowing. Not a frost settling on the outside of its hide. A full, deep, cellular freeze, the moisture in its tissue, in its blood, in the dense underlayer that had absorbed everything Sarel's warriors had thrown at it, all of it converting to structured ice lattice from the inside out before any signal from the creature's nervous system could reach any muscle that might have responded. The biology of a cryocascade in living tissue was not gradual. It was a state change. Like water becoming ice, not slowly, the way it does in a freezer, but the way it does when you drop a supercooled liquid and the whole thing converts in a single instant. One moment the Gorith was charging. The next moment it was a statue. 1 foot raised. Jaws open. The massive body locked in the exact shape it had been in at the moment of conversion, caught mid-motion like something preserved, like evidence of a thing that had been happening and was no longer happening. Ethan lowered the device. He checked the pressure gauge on the compression chamber out of habit. The seals had held. The power cell had delivered cleanly. The dispersal cone had been within 2 degrees of the intended geometry. He made a small mental note about the left seal, which had showed a minor variance he'd want to address before the next use. Then he straightened up, adjusted the rig on his shoulder, and looked at the frozen Gorith for a moment. It was, he thought, about 9 feet of ice now. maybe 9.5. He turned around. The courtyard was silent. Not the silence of people holding their breath. The silence that comes after a breath has been held so long that the body has forgotten it was doing it. Every Velri in the courtyard, the warrior line, the courtiers at the windows, the palace staff at the doorways, all of them, was still. They were looking at the frozen Gorith and then at Ethan and then at the frozen Gorith again, the way you look back and forth between two things when your brain is trying to establish which of them is the real piece of information. Vyra was 6 feet away. She had her blade still in her hand, and she had been moving forward when Ethan fired. He'd been aware of her in his peripheral vision, moving toward the Gorith, because she was the kind of person who moved toward things. She had stopped. She was looking at him. Not the way she looked at him in court. Not the Claything look, the brief, dismissive pass of her eyes that said she had already categorized him and moved on. This was different. This was the look of someone who had been operating with a complete map and had just discovered that the map was missing a significant portion of the territory. Ethan met her eyes for a moment. He nodded, the way you nod at someone across a room when there's nothing particular to say. Then he turned and walked toward the side entrance to the east wing. Owen Drake appeared from somewhere. Later, Ethan would never be entirely sure where Owen had been during the attack, and Owen would not volunteer this information, and fell into step beside him with the expression of a man whose entire professional life had just reorganized itself around a single event. What, Owen said, was that? Cryodispersal rig, Ethan said. Modified from a mining station atmospheric suppression unit. The standard ones use it for emergency containment when a pressurized section loses integrity. You need to be able to freeze a cascade event before it spreads into inhabited areas. I scaled it down for single-point application and adjusted the dispersal cone geometry for a moving target. Owen stared at him. You built a weapon, Owen said. I built a tool, Ethan said. Weapons are built to be used on people. This is built to stop things that are too large and too dense to stop any other way. We use the industrial version for rock fauna on the outer belt stations. They get into pressurized sections sometimes. The standard sidearms don't do anything useful to them. You've been building it since you arrived, Owen said. In your quarters. It needed some modifications for the gravity variance and the power cells I had available, Ethan said. Took a little longer than I expected. They reached the east wing door. Ethan held it open for Owen, who walked through in a daze and then turned around to look back at the courtyard, where the Velri warrior team was now cautiously approaching the frozen Gorith with the energy of people trying to determine whether something that looked completely inert was actually completely inert. They're going to have questions, Owen said. Probably, Ethan agreed. A lot of questions. Likely. Owen turned to look at him fully. Ethan, why didn't you tell anyone you had it? Ethan considered this for a moment. Genuinely, the way he considered things he found mildly puzzling. Nobody asked, he said. He went back to his quarters, took the rig off his shoulder, set it on the workbench, and wrote down the note about the left seal variance in his small, precise handwriting. He would need to address that before the compression chamber would be ready for a second use. Behind him, through the courtyard window, he could hear the sound of 200 Velri trying to find the language for something they had no category for. He thought they'd manage. They were, in his experience, a highly capable people. They just needed a moment. Vyra came to his quarters that night without attendance. This was, in Velri court protocol, a significant thing. The princess did not go anywhere without attendance. There were rules about this, safety rules, status rules, rules about what it meant for a member of the royal house to move through palace corridors unaccompanied. Ethan did not know all of these rules in detail, but he knew enough to understand that when the knock came at his door and he opened it and found Vyra standing alone in the corridor, something had shifted. She was not in court armor. She wore a plain grey robe, the kind of thing you wore when you were not performing anything for anyone, and her hands were at her sides, which he had never seen before. In court, she always had something in her hands, a cup, a document, a blade, something that said she was always in the middle of doing something and your conversation with her was happening alongside that. Empty hands were a different thing. He stepped back from the door. She came in. She looked at his quarters the way she had never been asked to look at them before, actually looked, rather than the inventory glance of someone confirming that a space matches their expectations. She took in the workbench, the tools laid out in the particular order he kept them, the components still remaining from the build. She looked at the note he'd written about the left seal variance, which was sitting open on the bench in his small handwriting. She crossed to the workbench and looked at the rig. Up close, It was not less ugly. The asymmetry was more obvious, and the places where he had adapted components for purposes they weren't originally designed for were visible if you knew what standard components looked like, which she apparently did. She had spent 2 years in Velri military engineering training before her court responsibilities had required her time elsewhere, which was one of the things in her official record that Ethan had read on the transit and stored away. "How did you build this?" she said. It came out as a statement rather than a question. She was talking to herself as much as to him. "The core mechanism is from a mining station atmospheric suppression unit," he said. "Standard Earth industrial equipment. I modified the dispersal nozzle for a focus cone rather than a room fill pattern, adapted the compression chamber for the power cells I could get from the supply requisitions, and changed the shoulder mount from the fixed wall bracket of the original unit to a portable rig." She was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the dispersal nozzle with the expression of someone reading a text in a language they mostly know. "How powerful is the original unit?" she said. "The standard room fill version runs about 40 times the output of what I built," Ethan said. "The industrial suppression units we use in inhabited station sections, the ones rated for full atmospheric cascade events, run closer to 100. She turned to look at him. He watched her do the arithmetic. He watched her put together what she had seen in the courtyard, the Gorith that had turned Sarel through a stone wall like a piece of paper, that had absorbed 7 warriors without slowing, frozen in mid-charge by something built on a workbench from supply requisitions, and scale it against 100 times that output, and understand what that meant, and understand further that this was not a weapon, this was an industrial safety tool, which meant it had not been built because humanity was preparing to fight something. It had been built because humanity had things around it large enough and dangerous enough that they needed casual access to this level of force just to go to work in the morning. "You let me call you a plaything," she said. Her voice was even. Not accusing, not apologetic. Recalibrating, the way a navigator recalibrates when the stars don't match the chart. "You weren't wrong about everything," he said. "I am smaller than your people. My bones break easier. I can't match your warriors in a straight physical contest. All of that is true." He picked up the note about the left seal and looked at it for a moment. "We just spent a long time in places where none of that was the thing that kept us alive. So we found other ways." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that another person might have filled the silence, but Ethan had learned in 11 years of deep orbital station work that silence was not a problem that needed solving. "The fault in the thermal grid," she said. 3 weeks ago. My engineers worked on it for 6 hours. "I saw it from the corridor," he said. "The cascade point was upstream of where they were looking." "You said nothing." "They didn't ask me anything," he said. "And they fixed it." She turned back to the workbench. She was quiet again. Outside the window, the courtyard was lit by the palace's night lighting, and the shape of the frozen Gorith was still visible. They hadn't moved it yet, because moving 9 feet of frozen Gorith turned out to require equipment that had to be located and assembled, which was taking some time. "My people have been in space for 3,000 years, Vira said. "I know," Ethan said. "We were building ships when your people were making marks on cave walls." "I know that too," he said. "And your people have been in space for 61 years, he said. 62 in the spring. She was very still for a moment. 61 years, she said quietly. "Give or take," he said. She looked at the frozen Gorith through the window. She looked at the rig on the workbench. She did the arithmetic again, differently this time, and Ethan watched her arrive somewhere that was probably uncomfortable and probably necessary. "What else do you have?" she said. "Earth. What else?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. He thought about the other engineers he'd worked with on the outer belt stations. He thought about the woman who'd figured out how to patch a hull breach with components from a food processing unit and 16 minutes to work with. He thought about the teams that had gone out into deep cold vacuum with tools rated for 3 hours and come back 6 hours later, finished. He thought about what 61 years of needing to be creative because you couldn't afford to be powerful had produced, quietly, in people who didn't talk about it much because there was always something else that needed doing. "A lot," he said. It was not a boast. It was a plain answer. The flatness of it was the most honest part. Vira left shortly after. She paused in the doorway on her way out, and she looked back at him once, not the court look, not the dismissal, and then she walked down the corridor and was gone. In the morning, the court was different. Not loudly different. Nobody made a speech. Nobody issued a formal revision of opinion about the clay thing from Earth. But the small things shifted. The warriors who had stood at the edge of the courtyard gave him a nod when he passed them in the corridor. The duty clerk who had approved all his requisitions stopped him and asked, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, what a compression seal was used for. One of the senior courtiers who had laughed the hardest on the first night was very busy looking at a document when Ethan walked by and did not look up. Commander Sarel, arm in a medical brace from the partition wall, found him in the east corridor after lunch. Sarel looked at him for a moment with the direct, evaluating look of a man whose respect was not given quickly and was not given for free. "The clay thing," Sarel said, and then stopped. He tried again. "The human." "Ethan," Ethan said. "Ethan," Sarel said. It came out accented but clear. "What is the device rated for?" "The maximum target size." "The version I built?" "Probably up to 12, 13 feet. Depends on tissue density." He paused. "The standard industrial version we use back home would handle most things I've seen in your records." Sarel nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they are filing something away in a place they will return to. He walked away without another word, which Ethan recognized as a form of respect in its own right. Ethan walked back to his quarters. He sat at the workbench. He picked up the note about the left seal variance and looked at it. He had 3 ideas already for how to address it. He picked up his tools and got to work, the same way he always did, quietly, thoroughly, without any performance for anyone. The galaxy was going to need some time to catch up. He didn't mind waiting. He had good work to do in the meantime.